Well, good morning to our Canadian audience and guten Tag to our German audience. My name's Aaron Woodrick, and I'm the Director of the Domestic Policy Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I want to welcome you to today's webinar presented by the MLI together with our friends at EPICO in Berlin, entitled Joining the Climate Club, Perspectives from Germany and Canada on International Climate Cooperation. Now, obviously, climate change is no small topic, often discussed, but the concept of climate clubs represent a relatively new approach to exploring ways to further boost international cooperation on climate action. And this year, members of the G7 committed to establishing just such a club by year's end. MLI and EPICO have co-written a paper, which was just released today, on the topic, and we'll be discussing that today. And to talk about it as well, we've assembled a panel of Canadian and German experts to discuss the shape that this climate club may take, what priorities it should have, and what challenges it will face. So I'd like to introduce today's participants before moving on to a discussion of the paper. We'll start with Bert Weber, who's the founder and director of EPICO, who will be moderating the discussion today. Heather Exner-Perot, who's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Parul Kumar, senior policy specialist environment at EPICO. Hubertus Barth, who's the managing director and head of research at the German Economic Institute. Marion Feist, Global Issues Associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And last but not least, Karsten Neuhoff, Head of Department of the Climate Policy Department at DIW Berlin. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for joining us today. And with this, I think we'll just pass it straight over to Parul and Heather to discuss their paper.
Thanks, Aaron. Heather, will you start showing the slides, please?
Share the slides there, Allison.
Thanks. If you could just move on to the first slide. So before we jump into the contents of the paper, I just want to provide a quick background on how the paper came about. So this is actually a part of a collaboration that we at EPICO have with MLI, and we had a few different elements in this cooperation, starting with a closed-door workshop, which was at the end of September, where we had experts from Germany and Canada discussing this topic and bringing their perspectives. Many of them are here today. Some others, like Jack Mintz and Chris Ragan, are not here, but we really use these discussions as a starting point to formulate our position on the Climate Club. The second element is the discussion paper, which we have just released today, and we can share the link in the chat shortly. This is being followed up with the webinar. So I think what was really interesting about the discussion paper was that the 5 authors, the ones mentioned on the screen just now, brought in really quite diverse perspectives, and to me personally, it was really an exciting process to see this paper shaping up and presenting really a variety of perspectives. Next slide, please. So we'd just like to begin with a quick overview of what a climate club means, or what it has meant in the even in the academic literature. So starting with the traditional club theory discussion, this is a reference to an exclusive club of benefits, and in the context of climate, this means the avoidance of free riding through trade benefits in particular, and through an international carbon price and trade sanctions. That's how it has been discussed, especially through Nordhaus, who's been the biggest proponent of this kind of club. But more in recent times, it has taken on a slightly different meaning, or a more, I would say, contextual meaning in the in light of the current challenges of climate change. So the first, I would say, the starting point in the German political discourse is a joint ministerial paper that was published in August 2021, highlighting the elements of what a climate club can be. And this focused on 3 points. So the ABC of the climate club was ambitious, bold, and cooperative. Just to quickly summarize, the focus here was on establishing a uniform carbon price globally, and using that to coordinate carbon leakage measures. In terms of the aims of the club, the focus was on industrial decarbonization, while also committing to principles in the Paris Agreement, such as common but differentiated responsibility principle. This was then reiterated. This position was reiterated in the German coalition agreement, which is the agreement of the current German federal government, which is a coalition. Once again, emphasizing that a uniform carbon price and a carbon border adjustment mechanism are crucial to such a climate club. Next slide, please. So earlier this year in June, when the G7 countries met in Elmau in Germany, we see the first, I would say, broader recognition of the club through a larger set of countries, and namely the G7. This statement, which is a really short two-pager, is based largely on the German ministerial paper, reiterating the commitment to goals such as accelerated industrial decarbonization and greater ambition. But at the same time, there are some significant deviations from the ministerial paper. First of all, the G7 statement is more policy agnostic, with expressing an inclusive approach to climate mitigation policies that are not carbon pricing. And secondly, there's no reference to a uniform minimum carbon price as the basis for a club. It expressly states that this club will be inclusive and open, and it does so in several places in the statement. And this really represents an evolution of the concept of the climate club in the political discourse. So now I'll hand it over to Heather for the next few slides.
Thanks for that, Parul, and thanks again for your leadership in the paper. So we started this, kind of from the intellectual viewpoint of the MLI, of trying to advance the discussion in different corners in Canada, that the discussion on carbon pricing has become very polarized, but that we are part of the G7. This is made as an agreement in the G7, and what is a constructive path to get more input and support for these kinds of policies. And so we had a great discussion, with Chris Reagan, and Jack Mintz were part of that and provided some of the guidance that we were following here. So as part of the paper, how, where we kind of took that is talking about the carbon pricing in the G7 context, and how, there are obviously very different approaches. So the European Union has its approach, and cap and trade. The UK is very much adopting a very similar approach. And then Canada has its carbon pricing, which is going up incrementally now. Whereas Japan has a very, very low carbon price and has not indicated, in the last 2 years with COVID and the energy crisis, any appetite to increase that. And where the United States is going in quite a different direction. So I think even at the time of the G7 statement, there is maybe still some thinking or some hope or some advocacy from Democrats of that kind of a federal model, but that now the American policy on climate is going to be dictated by the Inflation Reduction Act and kind of market-driven forces and subsidies and incentives and that kind of thing. There are states, I think a dozen states in the United States that do have carbon pricing, but not as high as Canada. And from that Canadian perspective, whereas the EU has a very large internal market, the United States has a very large internal market, it has really affected Canadian competitiveness in some industries to have a carbon price, whereas American competitors or colleagues do not. So that is some of the kind of the unique perspective from a Canadian side, which was great to work with our German colleagues and kind of mix those perspectives. So a lot of the discussion now is moving to board and carbon adjustments. Obviously, the carbon adjustment mechanism was already mentioned for the EU. UK is also considering something. Canada is also considering carbon border adjustments. And even the United States, which doesn't have a federal carbon price, is considering some kind of carbon adjustment to account for policies and the cost that climate policies impart onto domestic producers. The idea is to mitigate that migration of really carbon-intensive activity that may be cheaper from other places into places with more stringent climate policies. So we address that, and then some of the challenges that I mentioned, but also the whole context of the ongoing energy crisis. And we were just discussing before the call, COP27, that contrary to even a carbon pricing appetite for more carbon pricing, that in the last 10 months or so we have seen almost the opposite, where there's been €500 billion put into price caps and subsidies and tax decreases. Same in Canada. In the United States, we've seen the release of the SPR, for example. So there is a new element of, that needs to be reckoned with is how do you advance a climate club in the midst of an energy crisis, and kind of what is the political appetite for that? So we also discussed that. So one thing that, a solution, trying to be constructive, a solution that we determined was a constructive path forward, and had some practical appetite and political appetite, would maybe to move to a sectoral focus, where it's not just a carbon price or a carbon club generally, but focusing on particular industrial sectors. And we have seen, we talk about the Montreal Protocol, and we'll talk about that more, but as an example in the past of a particular environmentally driven sectoral focus, that involved industry and turned out to be very successful, eliminating substances that contribute to diminishing the ozone layer, so that there are practical constructive successes that we can model off of. So thinking about what would be selection criteria for determining a sector, a sector that might be conducive to a climate club. We talked about that would need to have a high international exposure of trade and value chains. Should be, GHG intensive, but, make it worth the effort. And also a concentration of relatively few actors in the field, so that it's easier to coordinate, and that, a particular number of actors could have a big impact, as we saw, for example, with the Montreal Protocol. Particular sectors that might be good candidates. We thought steel is being discussed, cement, and even maybe agriculture. And that also stemmed from, for example, in Canada, where our agricultural producers have carbon price attached, makes it very, really affects competitiveness with others that don't, and that maybe there's a way to move that forward. We also briefly mentioned, for example, shipping, which is, the Japanese have advanced a model for shipping, a carbon price on shipping, and that's a particular kind of strategy, but that there are sectors and there are countries advancing this kind of model with support of industry, and that seems to be a practical way forward. So finally, some of the functions of the ones that we were thinking of with steel and cement or agriculture would be coordinating standards and policies, some specific knowledge sharing, innovation transfer, standards for emissions reduction, and having peer review processes to monitor that and ensure compliance. And I'll pass it back over to you, Parul.
Thanks, Heather. So the next aspect that we looked at, which we actually think is quite complementary to the first one, which is the sectoral one, is cooperation with developing countries. And this dual framing is actually reflected also in the G7 statement, which commits to both of these goals. So industrial decarbonization as well as support for developing countries. The commitment to the Paris Agreement principles is also noted in the G7 statement, and here we would just like to point out two important aspects. The first being the common but differentiated responsibilities principle in Article 2, and the climate finance obligations also contained in the Paris Agreement, which are particular to highlight also due to the problems that this field has been plagued with so far. And so we discussed this, and we find that there is really a need for deeper cooperation and the strengthening of institutional frameworks in this context, especially in a way that the Paris Agreement alone cannot do. And so we think that this cooperation aspect is really a natural fit for the Climate Club. And here it's also important to mention the ongoing efforts in the Just Energy Transition Partnership. So the first one is, of course, the one with South Africa, which was announced at COP26. And we also discuss to some detail the kinds of challenges that are being faced in this partnership. And given that there are similar such partnerships coming up, in the next few months and years, the Climate Club could actually offer a very useful and strategic institutional framework for developing such new partnerships. Next slide, please. So lastly, we discussed the the governance structure that that a climate club could have, and here we've actually just limited our focus to principles and value addition of such a climate club. So it deserves mentioning that the Paris Agreement is a behemoth, and it's a multilateral process with a focus on large overarching goals, but sometimes the ambition to meet the goals through specific aspects of transitions is not adequately realized. And here we feel that the Climate Club can play a role in increasing ambition, particularly since the plurilateral format offers cooperation and collaboration with limited political costs. And here we also have the advantage of potential positive spillover effects, so as to incentivize other non-club countries to get on board. I mean, here also I think the experience from the Montreal Protocol is instructive, and we can learn from this. So what exactly do we envisage here? I mean, we don't envisage a new parallel process, but we can imagine that a climate club could play a very useful role in meeting the Paris Agreement goals, or to accelerate the progress and the ambition. And we see the role of soft coordination with existing initiatives, including being open, to existing alliances which are focused on industry and just transition, and deepening the cooperation, especially between developing countries and developed countries. As I mentioned before, here the institutional structure can really play a very important role and contribute to improved ambition. Next slide, please. So we'd just quickly like to sum up our findings over the course of the paper. I mean, so one of the first things we established is that the shift from a top-down carbon pricing focused approach to a more flexible plurilateral approach that is more open could really have very useful benefits. And this is also clear from existing experiences in international climate cooperation. We think that the alliance building should have sectoral focus areas and offer avenues for coordinating policies, including through processes such as peer review, which could also lead to policy diffusion, in our opinion. And this would be a unique international forum for knowledge sharing and communication. Often there are policies, even on climate mitigation measures, that are being undertaken by certain countries, but other countries don't know enough about them. And so we think this is certainly a very useful function to fulfill. How can the effectiveness of climate finance deliberations be improved through the Climate Club? Here we see two important aspects. The first is the strengthening of an institutional framework for enhanced cooperation and building of partnerships. And the second is cooperation on sectoral topics, which are particularly important given the criteria that Heather mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. And yeah, lastly, just to reiterate, we see the Climate Club as a complement to the Paris Agreement, certainly not a substitute. And we are of the opinion that it can aid and supplement the Paris Agreement process through developing institutional structures that have been difficult to establish given the nature of the UNFCCC, but at the same time increasingly necessary for more enhanced cooperation. And lastly, we also see the value addition of the Climate Club alongside existing initiatives such as the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, particularly with a view to improving the institutional framework and effectiveness. So that's all. Next slide, please. That's just the last slide. Thank you so much for listening. And our paper is available online. We'll be posting the link shortly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Parul and Heather, for this very insightful presentation. I think it perfectly underlines that Germany has been the driver to take this concept forward. And however, other countries, even in the G7, they don't share the same vision. The US is heading in another policy direction. We've heard that, which is precisely why it is so important to discuss this realistically and pragmatically, what shape a climate club may take. And it's really of great importance to broaden this discussion. And this means that we do not only discuss this in Europe, but to discuss this with partners, and especially with our key partners, such as Canada, which is also why we are very happy that we have experts from both sides of the Atlantic here on our panel, and who have also contributed to the paper. And I would like to jump right into the discussion. Now, on Sunday, we have a UN climate conference, COP27, and I would say a quite difficult one. Negotiations right now are stalling due to the geopolitical tensions, due to the concerns on the high energy prices. And at the same time, we all know we need to move faster towards implementing emission reduction measures. So my first question, and I would like to direct it to you, Marian, is what's the role of Climate Club alongside this UN process? And what can we expect from COP27 with regard to climate clubs?
Yeah, thanks very much. Exactly like you said, the UNFCCC process can be somewhat slow and cumbersome. And the Paris Agreement, which is still the major reference framework for anything that happens in international climate politics, does not include any kind of strong enforcement mechanisms. There are some mechanisms in there that oblige countries to ratchet up their ambitions and report on the progress they have made, but there would be normative enforcement mechanisms in the sense that you would be exposed as a laggard as a country if you don't step up to your own ambition. So in light of this idea, there's some debate now in scholarly circles to what degree these mechanisms are actually effective. But if you look at the rising emissions, you can certainly say that they're not effective enough. And against this background, there are several appeals of alternative plurilateral formats of cooperation, like the Climate Club that was proposed in the context of the G7. One was already mentioned in the presentation, obviously, to protect ambitious countries against the advantages that might be faced by first mover countries, the disadvantages faced by first mover countries, and to avoid carbon leakage. Then, as we write in the paper, there's a chance to drive implementation in a way that makes more sense for specific sectors. There's some debate now as well on whether the COP should focus more on decarbonization in specific sectors of the economy, because that's where the decarbonization actually happens. And the club allows for more flexibility in these regards. But ultimately, the idea or the big appeal behind going for a smaller cooperative format like a climate club, rather than the larger UNFCCC format from a political perspective, is that it looks to be like a politically relatively inexpensive option to move things forward in a smaller group of like-minded countries, making it easier to cooperate and more effective than in the multilateral UN process. And as Paolo said, these are not mutually exclusive. The German government certainly is the one that pushed and proposed this climate club, but it's also very much still subscribed to the idea of multilateral climate cooperation. However, what we see as well in the way that the negotiations leading up to the G7 club have been going is that it's even in smaller arrangements of like-minded countries, it's not easy to agree on policy change that would be required to implement something in the scope of common carbon price. So there is a danger of watering down the initial ambition that was connected with a more Nordhaus style carbon club, and in the sense also to some extent defeating the very purpose of going small scale in the first place. But as the presentation highlighted, there's still benefit in harnessing the greater flexibility and speed at which a smaller cooperative format like a climate club can move.
Yeah, thank you, Marian. Speaking of climate cooperation and difficulties to agree, now one promise given at previous climate conferences by which countries was to provide 100 billion euro for climate action in developing countries. So far, this has not been achieved, or although there has been some progress. So, Carsten, I would like to get your thoughts on how a climate club might help to support transition in other countries, notably in developing countries, and how this might actually help us to broaden the concept of climate clubs and to make more countries be ready to join it. Carsten.
I think at the end it's money, but it's also the political commitment that is needed for such a cooperation. And I think as soon as we go to a sector level, cooperating across a set of countries, one can clearly define the objectives: a share of electromobility, cars, public transport, or clean steel. And I think then it gets easier for policymakers at a senior level to sign up to a joint target. But then also there's a more equal-based cooperation across the countries, all face pretty much the similar challenges, can exchange, swap ideas how to address them, can perhaps benefit by jointly taking forward policies or market developments such where they can cooperate. And I think this is where an alliance across countries with a clearly defined target can make tangible progress and can, by defining the joint objective, then also clarify what is needed to make this happen. And I think it's a lot easier for a policymaker in Germany, for example, to sign up to commit money if it's clear what the money is used for and what will be the outcome from this. So I think this cooperation along such alliances will be a very important part of also unlocking the funding.
Thanks, Carsten. Hubertus, I would like to bring you in and with you like to factor in the perspective of the economy of the industrial sector. Now, if we would focus on such alliance building on very precisely defined areas, would that be helpful from a industrial perspective?
Well, I think when I talk with people from manufacturing, what they concern, one of their main concerns is different rules, different prices, explicit or implicit prices in different parts of the world. So when we talk about level playing fields, so do we all pay the same price, or do we have very different prices and therefore an advantage for those who aren't that committed to reducing emissions? Therefore, I'm convinced that if there is something like a sectoral agreement or an industry agreement, limited in scope, but ambitious in content, it would be very helpful to, on the one hand side, create something like a joint approach and joint effort to solve the problems within a sector, and on the other hand side, arguing and being certain that you don't have a disadvantage because you're more climate friendly. So that's why I think finding a sector or an industry which is small enough that there is a limited number of players in the world, and with that limited number of players, one new sectoral or industry standard could be defined. That would be, from my point of view, a promising way of a climate club. Limited, but quicker than the big international UNFCCC approach.
Thanks, Hubertus. If you had to pick one sector where to start, which one would that be?
Well, obviously, we have to look at sectors that have a high climate impact. Emission costs should be or must be high in that industry. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense, or otherwise we don't have a problem with international competition and different rules of competition. So we're pretty quickly, for example, looking at basic materials like part of the chemical industry, which is especially complex because everything is very much interlinked. So we can look at steel or aluminium or other basic metals. The problem always is that even if you're talking about a club of well, let's say progressive or democratic or whatever countries, we always have to take China into account, because in those industries which are basic industries, which are very carbon intensive, China is a big market share. So either we have to bring them into the club, or we have to, well, create something like a carbon border adjustment with all those risks in terms of trade policies and trade conflicts. But as long as the sector is small, and if you're talking about a climate club, it's something like we can prototype, so we can try something. And if you find something where the economic, well, from maybe a Chinese point of view, economic threat is not that big because the sector is not that important, could be possible to bring them on board.
Yeah, thank you. Also for bringing in this geopolitical perspective. I would like to bring in our Canadian friends, Heather and Aaron. So besides Germany, other countries are, of course, discussing this concept. Also Canada, which has expressed some interest, not only on the level of the G7, but also in bilateral talks with Germany. So what is the Canadian view on climate clubs in the think tank discourse in Canada? And how could potentially a Canadian-German cooperation help to take the concept forward?
Well, I appreciate the question and also the partnership that you guys brought, because I think the Climate Club model is more European, is more German, has been a higher political priority for Germany, and was kind of the signature proposal of the German presidency of the G7, and it hasn't reached that same level of public discourse in Canada, and that's some of the gap that we're trying to fill with this paper and with this webinar and with this cooperation, is to think about if we're going to have this Climate Club model for the G7, then what are some perspectives from outside of Europe. And so I think Canada already has carbon pricing. There has been opposition to carbon pricing, obviously, in industrial sectors in Canada, maybe particularly in the West. And like I said, it has become very polarized. And yet there is willingness from everyone to do, climate mitigation adaptation policies, to do their share, but not at the expense of ruining the competitiveness of your industry, whether it's obviously, petroleum kind of products, oil and gas, agriculture, those kinds of things. So I think taking the approach, that we are suggesting and that is being suggested of that sectoral-led approach is more pragmatic. We'll have more political support. There are already efforts being done, for example, to reduce methane or to move to net zero. And so it's not as though money and time is not being spent on it, but to do it in a way that as you said, levels that, feels like you're leveling the playing field. Whereas I think for a lot of industrial sectors in Canada, they feel very much isolated from the conversation and from the solutions. And so anyway, so that's, one reason, so I think evolving this conversation out of the more theoretical, economic, and also from the domain of kind of purely economic organization or environmental organizations into a kind of a broader swath of Canadian public is a very important kind of constructive step. Aaron, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
Not that much, other than to your original question, Bernd, about what do Canadian think tanks think about that? Well, you're looking at it. There hasn't been a lot of work done specifically. Obviously, as I mentioned off the top, climate policy they're seized with. I think, now that this has been established as something for a priority through the G7, we hope to see more on this focus. I think it's helpful to have this parallel track, and especially the obstacle with respect to carbon pricing, carbon taxes. This is, we have it in place in Canada now, but there's no political consensus on it the way there is in other places. So it remains a risk. So anything that allows the conversation to be broader and to allow us to look at other tools and other approaches to continue to move the ball forward, I think is a welcome development.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's already an important insight which we have developed here, that we need to refrain from a top-down approach focusing purely on carbon pricing, and think of the carbon clubs in a much more flexible, implementable way, maybe in terms of alliance building, and maybe with regard to one specific sector to start with. So that would be also my question to you now, when we're thinking of this on a very pragmatic level. What is the main challenge to take it forward? Or second question, alongside this, what can be the next step, really? That's a question I would like to address to all our panelists, to help us to develop this discussion further on this pragmatic level. Any ideas on this?
Maybe I can start. Sorry, go ahead, Carsten.
Ladies first, Paul.
Okay, thanks. So just some thoughts on even the terminology club. So like we mentioned, the term comes from club theory, which is all about exclusivity, and also just given that initial iterations of this concept were quite closely linked to carbon leakage and measures to counter it. So more specifically in the German ministerial paper, I sense that there could be some mistrust associated with the concept, even in the form that it's portrayed in the G7 statement. So I think that there needs to be a bit more narrative building, just so that partner countries don't perceive the club as some kind of proxy for the CBAM, for example, or a proxy for carbon pricing measures. I think this is a really important step. And I think the other thing I would like to point out is that the G7 statement makes a mention of the club being inclusive, and then it goes on to say that the G7 countries invite consultations from other countries. But I would actually see this as maybe a more, I would think it would be more strategic to have a more proactive approach, where the G7 countries initiate consultations with the partner countries to really find out what they would like to see in a climate club or a climate alliance, because this could, the danger of the G7 statement is that it could come across as the perspective of a set of developed industrialized countries, and yeah, again, we don't want the dangers of a top-down approach. So I think just trying to customize it to the needs of other partner countries is an important step, which we should implement at the earliest. It should be also at the stage of goal setting and identifying areas of focus that other countries, including China and India, need to be involved in.
Many thanks, Carsten. What do you want to add?
I think building on Heather's point as well, I feel it can be a group where you want to be part of, because we all know that we need to move to climate neutrality, that at some point you cannot sell dirty products anymore, that you don't get financing anymore. And so I think it's not something where you have to push countries to be part of such an alliance, but it's more something which countries open up, and everyone that wants to join has a motivation in a specific sector to work together, then can jointly develop the standards, the cooperation elements, the funding. Which then, coming to Parul's element in terms of the CBAM, I think what we need to do therefore at the European side is really to clearly distinct this element of CBAM from this climate club, which was part of the initial motivation, but things evolve over time. And I think we've, in Europe, started the CBAM debate with two policy objectives. One is to kind of reach out internationally in terms of creating incentives to reduce emissions, to implement carbon pricing, and the other one to allow domestically an effective carbon price. And I think this is where we have to do our homework in Germany, in Europe, to make sure the CBAM is purely focused in a way that allows for an effective carbon pricing domestically, without of any of its international interventions, such that it then creates more of the space of saying, hey, you want to work together, because I think it's really something of a big opportunity to modernize our economies, making this transition, and working together on this opportunity, I think should be and will be attractive for a lot of countries.
May I add one aspect, Bernd? Yeah, Carsten's right, but on the other hand side, the discussions about carbon border mechanisms in various countries is maybe the entry door for discussing climate clubs. Why that? Because when we are talking about carbon pricing or carbon pricing border adjustment, we always also discuss about what is an equivalent regulation or implicit pricing in another country, which excludes from the necessity to be priced at the border. And if everyone is doing that, we're talking de facto about implicit standards in various countries. What's the standard we accept that it's similar to the price we have here? And that's pretty unsystematic, and well, everyone needs to discuss that if some kind of border mechanism should be discussed. So bringing, and especially that's true in those industries that are exposed internationally, have a high carbon impact, and fear unlevel playing field, or fear an advantage of countries not being so committed to carbon reductions. So I think that's an idea, or that's the scenario where if you say, well, let's not just everyone discuss it for itself, but let's talk about the standards that evolve around the world, or in a number of countries at least, and if they agree on a certain set of standards, what's acceptable or what's accepted as similar to the regulation we have here, or the price we have here, that's pretty close to a carbon club.
Thank you, Hubertus. So that's definitely one challenge which we need to address, the question of CBAM in relation to climate clubs. So I would like to pick up what you just said, Carsten, that this is a club everybody should want to be a member of. Now, Stephen from the audience, for example, raised a question, and I think it's a valid one. How a country like Canada can be part of this club without the US as the major neighbor, and for us, of course, in Germany and Europe as a major partner, not being on board. So my very concrete, precise question here would be how to get key partners such as the US on board as a member of the Climate Club. Any thoughts on this?
I can start as I think that's the advantage of the sectoral approach. That it's not all of America or all the federal government, but a particular sector that major players are committing to the best practice. And a lot of major players in a lot of industrial sectors are already doing, for investment reasons and for their shareholders, are already putting in, again, time and money into reducing their carbon emissions. And so for those who are out front leading a sectoral initiative, will actually reward them, where everyone else that they're competing with will also have to meet the best practices, will also have to put in, the time and the money to get to where the kind of industry leaders are going. And so again, for, the Canadian oil and gas industry, for petrochemicals, for agriculture, where there is a sense that, they are doing a lot, that they're having others that they're competing against meeting the same kind of standards or agreeing to similar standards would probably be very attractive. And so I don't think we need to look at it as I think we discussed amongst ourselves and moved away from a G7 country climate club, and certainly away from a carbon price, that's not going to happen. The Americans are going in a different direction. But that's why in particular sectors, the kinds that we talked about, transportation, manufacturing, those kinds, again, just, deciding for themselves without a top-down government approach, but deciding for themselves what are those high standards that they think they can meet and that they'll commit to.
Thank you very much, Heather. If nobody wants to add something to this, I would pick up on what you just said, and was also on the criticism that was voiced by Parul, saying that the G7 is very often perceived, of course, as a rich countries club, and not necessarily the best institution to take this forward. Now, while we should adopt a sectoral approach, I couldn't agree more with you, Heather. The question still remains, what can be an international institution or some kind of institution which can be helpful in facilitating climate clubs if it's not the G7? Any thoughts on this on the panel? Carsten, please.
I'm not sure it is the time to really allocate the institutional responsibility. You have IEA, OECD, or others that in principle can do such a task. But I think it's more about really defining the functions, what you want to do together. And as I think the paper outlines quite nicely, under the bigger umbrella of the Paris Agreement, what is then the specific additional element, the governance requirements? And once this is clarified, I think that there will be multiple institutions that are interested to kind of host the responsibility for this. And I think retaining that competition between institutions such that they like to do something rather than being tasked to do something they have been mandated without of being asked makes perhaps more sense.
Thank you very much. I would pass on a question from the audience to the panel, which brings us back to the sectoral level. And it's from Geoffrey, and he is wondering, how can you actually create an alliance, even at an industry level, when a number of the largest producers are not participating from the very beginning? And he was thinking of clean steel in China. What are your thoughts on this? Heather, you're smiling. Carsten, you're raising your hand. So maybe we start with Carsten.
No, you have to start with Carsten, because mine won't be as sophisticated economically.
I think the charm of such an alliance is that you can jointly develop standards and perspectives. And I think every big producer wants to then also become part of such a group. And also China in the past always has been very interested in participating in such groups to jointly develop the pathways. So I'm optimistic that if we define it really as a pathway towards modernization, towards the new standards of clean products, which are low carbon production, recyclable, energy efficient, whatever it might be, I think then it will be quite attractive for a lot of countries to join such an alliance.
Thank you, Carsten. So this is of course not the first international cooperation in the realm of climate, so we should probably also wonder, what are the learnings from past international cooperations on emission reduction, such as the Montreal Protocol, for example, or potentially also others, the just transition partnerships, for example. So we understood already that it's challenging to establish a climate club. What are the major learnings that we can withdraw from already existing partnerships or previous partnerships and cooperation formats in order to take it forward? I think, Hubertus, you might have a view on this.
Yeah, and maybe it also gives an answer, some idea of an answer to the last question. So first, what we learn is that that's not new, that smaller groups are better organized and better to be organized than larger groups. So a club of a few countries could be more effective, or could be easier to find a consensus than the group of 190 plus countries, and therefore could be quicker, could be more ambitious. That's what the Montreal Protocol basically did. It was a handful, I don't know, 24 of countries that produced practically all of those ozone layer harmful substances, and therefore was able, after a long period of time, to cope with that global problem. Still not a country like China, obviously. That's a point which remains valid. Another example is for a sectoral agreement. We already have one in climate. We have CORSIA. It's sectoral based, or it's the aviation industry basically, and of course you can criticize a lot and discuss if that offsetting approach within CORSIA is sufficient or it's not, or if it takes too long or not. But they found a way to not set a common price, but set some kind of standards and integrating more and more and more and more, and have a long time path, even including every major airliner who flies internationally, also the Chinese ones. Might be, I mean, we're not at the end of that process yet. We don't know if it really works out as it has been planned and agreed on, but it has the potential to might be more successful than the European approach a couple of years ago, just pricing the international aviation from Europe and back, including Chinese airliners. So that might be one way, finding and developing standards and defining pathways to include China in that. The other way, I mean, if it wouldn't be possible, and if that would be part of a ongoing conflict, then we are back to international carbon pricing, to carbon border adjustment, and more close to, well, I mean, what the original concept meant, and what we have, or what we're discussing in Europe. You can also describe the European emission trading scheme as part of as some kind of a carbon club. It's a number of countries that agreed on within that international institution, or that European institution, European framework, on a common carbon price. I mean, obviously, no, it's difficult to include many more countries in that, but now we are discussing about what we have to do at the borders. So if you have almost everyone but China within an industry-related carbon club, it would be easier to discuss what to do at that remaining border. But the more, I mean, the more positive way and more constructive approach would obviously be to define an evolving process where China can join from the beginning, not with all obligations, but with starting with some obligations or some standards, and then having a clear path to develop them.
I'd like to add, sorry.
No, you go first.
Go ahead.
Add.
Okay, I just quickly wanted to add a couple of things on the Montreal Protocol, because I really think that it offers some learnings for us also as we discuss the Climate Club. So first of all, as Hubertus mentioned, was a small number of countries to start with, but it really grew, and this is the only international agreement that has the distinction of having all the countries on board. But I think here also we need to closely examine some of the elements. So first of all, it was not a top-down price-based coalition. It was focused on the goal of reducing the impact of the ozone gases. And this was actually built around concepts such as technology transfer, support for developing countries. So it really recognized the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, in its very essence. And maybe a last point that I'd like to mention is that through these commitments at the policy level by countries, an important signal was also sent to the industry, which was then able to be more ambitious in its, in the implementation from the industry side. Over to you, Heather.
Yeah, maybe we'll go back, and some of the questions have been on this, on kind of the trade implications. And this is maybe more provocative and is beyond the scope of what we discussed in our paper, but that there is geopolitically right now a push to also friendshore, to source more of our supply chain from friendly countries, and kind of the values associated with carbon intensity, environmental protection are almost a perfect Venn diagram of allies that we would prefer to friendshore our supply chains with. And so on one hand, that's appealing, that if there's I won't say this elegantly, but a way to diminish, Chinese influence in particular sectors with carbon initiatives. In one sense, that may be appealing, and I know that's not the intention. On the other hand, which we address a little bit in the paper, is that we don't want to violate WTO. That free trade is very important, for the economic prosperity of the world, and also do not want to, use this as a backhanded way to limit the competitiveness of developing countries. You know, that not, again, where a rich country is using one more mechanism to exclude or to prevent economic growth in others. So it's a very interesting dynamic, but I feel like it's one that is deserving of more attention going forward as we do try to get off kind of supply chain procured from authoritarian countries that almost certainly won't share the same climate values or certainly the standards that we share in those that are, you know, looking to be part of a climate club.
Carsten, please. You want to add something?
I like the expression French source sessions, heard that before. I think in this discussion, what I felt is helpful is to really differentiate between the tactic use of trade instruments to get a certain response or support of a certain country, which can then change as the government or the policy changes in that country. And the use of trade-related instruments in the context of carbon pricing, where effectively you're looking for a long-term investment strategy that you want to support for companies involved in this. And I think where we are struggling with the CBAM mechanism, that it tries to do both at the same time and fails on both ends, perhaps to some extent at the same time. And that's why I think if we talk more about carbon pricing and think of mesh mechanisms, and there are options how one can use it as a domestic policy tool, purely domestic, without any of the tactics of achieving international objectives, then it allows for a far more effective domestic carbon pricing. And then you can still have an open discussion whether what kind of instruments are suitable to what kind of international partners, to friendshore or to kind of climate friendshore, whatever the terminology might be that is part of such a debate now. If we mix it up, I think then an inherently complex policy instrument like carbon pricing gets even more complex in the geopolitical context. And I think then it just doesn't achieve anything. And I think that's what we've observed in Europe, to be frank, for 15 years. So we haven't really seen much impact of ETS on industrial transformation. It had some purpose in power sectors, but there it is, carbon leakage was not an issue. I just think if we keep on discussing carbon pricing in such a context of overlaying a CBAM and international objectives with it, then I don't think we'll achieve anything. And certainly the lessons I've taken away from the sectoral agreements, which were 15 years ago, the international instrument, not too dissimilar from what we're talking about now at a sectoral corporation, they were at the same time attempting to implement carbon pricing across multiple jurisdictions, countries. And it was abandoned at some point because it was seen to be too difficult to pursue. So perhaps you can go back to that experience and learn the lesson and really say, okay, we can work together in coalitions, but allow every country to pursue the carbon price, but not have carbon pricing now as our short or midterm objective, as a common objective in there. That would be my lesson there.
Thank you very much, Carsten. And with an eye to the timekeeping, I suggest we wrap it up. Thanks a lot for a very insightful discussion. I have 3 takeaways that I would like to share with you as concluding remarks. So I think it became very clear that we need a broader discussion on the climate clubs. Firstly, in terms of socializing the concept beyond Europe, if we wanted to take off, and therefore we would need it to be more pragmatic and more implementable. Secondly, that we need to move away from a top-down approach, focusing solely on carbon pricing. That doesn't work. And we need to focus much more on flexibility, on alliance building in matters of policy, finance, technology, and trade. And I think a promising venue is to combine the negotiations under the UN Climate Convention with initiatives to bring together like-minded and ambitious countries to accelerate the transformation. And the first step could be to focus on pilot sectors for a climate club. Many of these promising ideas have been spelled out in the EPICO and MLI paper, which is now on the website of both our organizations. So please make sure to download it and take a closer look. On behalf of MLI and EPICO, I would like to thank you all for joining this event today. In particular, I would like to thank the authors of the paper, the MLI for the cooperation on this important topic, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Canada for the generous support of this project, and of course, first and foremost, all you who have joined us here, especially our Canadian friends, where it's still quite early, I believe. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time.